Okay, well, how did that go? Did you see your eyes move? Were you surprised at how little perhaps you saw? Sounds like a great topic to kick to the discussion forum, so why don't we do that and see if we can generate some good discussion around what you observe during saccadic eye movements. Well, let's move on then and talk about smooth pursuit eye movements. Now, smooth pursuit eye movements typically require a visual target. It's really difficult to generate this without a visual target. You might want to try that in the presence of a friend who can actually watch your eyes move and perhaps give you some confirmation as to actually what you're doing. But try to just sweep your point of fixation across the sky as if you were watching a bird that doesn't actually exist. It's really difficult. What you'll probably do is make a series of short little saccadic eye movements rather than sweeping your eyes as if you were tracking an actual object. Well, I was recently taking a holiday with my family, and we happened to be seaside and surrounded by a variety of seagulls, and I couldn't help but to think about smooth pursuit eye movements on that occasion while I tried to track the movement of these birds through the crisp early spring air. And it just reminded me that in order to make smooth pursuit eye movements, one really does have to acquire a visual target. So this is typically how this goes. Some visual target is moving across the visual scene at some particular velocity, as indicated by these red lines here, with different velocities, as indicated by the slopes of the line. And if we were to decide to have a look at one of these objects that's moving, what would happen is that we would make a saccade to that target, very quick movement in about 200 milliseconds or less. And then once we acquire the target, then we can track very nicely the movements of that target without that kind of jerkiness that I tried to demonstrate with my finger just a moment ago. So this is what's called smooth pursuit, and because a visual target is necessary, the circuitry is going to be actually quite complex. It's going to involve processing in the visual parts of the cortex back in the occipital lobe, but it will also require activation of circuitry in the parietal lobe and in the frontal lobe that's involved in integrating the location of that visual target as it moves through space and generating the appropriate motor response. So we'll have a little bit more about that at the very end. But for now, I just want you to appreciate the complexity of the smooth pursuit eye movement. It's actually much more complicated than it may at first appear. Okay, so let's move on then and talk about the next type of eye movement, the optokinetic movements. Now, optokinetic movements come in different forms and different varieties, and here's one example of an optokinetic movement. Imagine that you're standing at a railroad crossing, as I often am, and a train goes by. And that train generates a very distinct pattern of linear motion from one side to the next. And so there are various elements of that train, vertical features, for example, that are passing in one direction or the other through your visual field. It's really difficult not to be grabbed by that visual stimulus. And what happens? Well, what happens is that we tend to make a saccadic eye movement to some feature on that train. Maybe it's a window in a coach car, or maybe a door on a box car. And then as that object passes in front of us, we essentially make a smooth pursuit eye movement. But very quickly, our eyes reach the limit of excursion in the orbit, and it causes us to make a quick saccadic-like movement where we reset and acquire the next object that allows us to track using our smooth pursuit system. Well, again, our eyes reach the limit of their movement in the orbit, and we make another saccadic eye movement back. So this sort of sawtooth pattern is very characteristic of optokinetic nystagmus. You may remember this word, nystagmus. We talked about it when we considered the vestibular system. It has to do with a nodding That's what this word means, a nodding, as if we're falling asleep. So there's a slow movement, and then there's a quick reflexive movement in the opposite direction. Well, just as we had a vestibular nystagmus that could be an indication of the fact that we may have been recently spinning, or there may actually be dysfunction in the vestibular system, so we can have an nystagmus without movement of our head, being driven entirely by the movements of the visual scene. So this is why this is called optokinetic nystagmus, to be distinguished from vestibular nystagmus. So the stimulus here is visual. It's the large-scale movement of the visual scene. Now, not all optokinetic movements are nystagmic. That is, they don't always involve this slow and then rapid, fast resetting. Sometimes optokinetic movements can simply help to stabilize our vision when there is extremely slow drift in the visual scene. Well, in fact, we'll get to vestibulo-ocular motions in just a moment. The optokinetic system works in a very complementary way to the vestibulo-ocular system in order to stabilize our fixation. So this graph here simply shows us the gain of the optokinetic system and the vestibulo-ocular system across motion frequencies. And what we find is that for the optokinetic system, the gain is quite high when the motion is quite slow. So this is a very slow movement, and the optokinetic system helps to stabilize our gaze when there's very slow drift in the visual field. Maybe that drift is because our eyes are moving ever so slightly, or it's because the visual world is moving ever so slightly. Well, as the rate of movement begins to increase, then our optokinetic system can no longer keep pace. And that's okay, because our vestibulo-ocular system now kicks in. So once we are approaching movements at still a fairly moderate pace, nothing terribly quick about them, then our vestibulo-ocular reflex can maintain fixation control while there is motion, in this case of the head. So these two systems work in a complementary fashion. At very low rates of change, our optokinetic system maintains fixation. At high rates of change, as our head is moving, then our vestibulo-ocular reflex will help maintain our fixation through conjugate eye movement. Well, that does bring us to a brief mention again of the vestibulo-ocular reflex. I'll just again point you back to our tutorial on the vestibular system if you want to know more or refresh yourself about the vestibulo-ocular reflex. It's detailed here in this figure from chapter 14. I'll just remind you that the whole purpose here is to maintain fixation as we move our head. And so I'm trying to maintain fixation now at the camera while my head goes back and forth. And as I move my head to the left, my eyes rotate to the right. And the reason why is that as I turn my head to the left, I'm activating the horizontal canal on the left side of my head. That's driving excitatory signals that are going to cross the midline. That's going to activate the motor neurons in the medullus nucleus, which will innervate the lateral rectus and pull that eye towards the left. Meanwhile, there are internuclear interneurons that will project from one abducens nucleus to the contralateral oculomotor nucleus, and then that will drive the contraction of the medial rectus muscle in the other eye to produce a synergistic rotation of both eyes in a conjugate fashion, exactly opposite to the motion of the head. So the head goes to the left, the eyes go to the right.